So, are you guys familiar with the saying, you come into this world alone and then you go out alone? You know that saying? When I hear it, I think, yes, we come in alone, we go out alone. What about all this space in the middle, this space that is our life, and how often in our lives we feel that same kind of alone that they're talking about in that saying? It's a very specific feeling because it's not on the outside, it's here, sort of alone on the inside with yourself. And you know it's that kind of alone when you're going through something and suddenly you realize only you can get you through. I'm just convinced that so much of how we feel about ourselves and how we sit in our lives is a result of how we get through the hard stuff and how we deal with this place on the inside. I went through a difficult experience as a younger girl and found myself having to reckon with this place inside. I learned a lot from it. So I'm number 5 out of 7 kids. I was raised in an affluent bubble of a suburb outside of Chicago, in the top 2% of the overprivileged in America. Our life did not see a whole lot of struggle. We had an abundance of love and support and opportunity. Like, in general, my life was a really safe and easy place to be. So in the summer of 1979, going into my senior year of high school, I had sex with my boyfriend for the first time. Every time I say that sentence, it feels completely ridiculous, but trust me, that's gonna go somewhere in this story. So, after having sex for the first time, this was not something that he and I talked about or planned. This was something that just sort of happened. And honestly, I wasn't even quite sure that it happened when it was over. You know what I mean. So 4.5 months later, I find out I'm pregnant. That is when I was sure that we did it. I was actually on vacation in the British Virgin Islands with my dad and a bunch of siblings sailing on a big sailboat when I learned this. I decided to wait to get home to tell my recently divorced parents together. Still probably the least fun conversation I've ever had in my life. You know, they were obviously shocked, disappointed, and gravely concerned about my future. The one thing that my parents agreed upon that day was that no one could ever find out that this happened to me. So, it was decided that I would go away and hide in a Catholic home and have the baby and give it up for adoption and get back to graduate from high school. My mother was completely convinced, with all that she was, that if anybody ever found this out, it would ruin my life, truly. So they told my brothers and sisters, my grandparents, my friends, the dog, the mailman, everybody, that I was sick and living in the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. So a couple days after that conversation with my parents, my mom found a place and we got in the car to drive a few states away to drop me off. Quietest drive in the history of the world. And when I arrived is when I learned that this wasn't a Catholic home. It was a locked government-run facility for delinquent, underprivileged, wayward, pregnant teenagers. A world completely foreign to me, a world I didn't even know existed. So I lived there for 5 months, no contact with anybody I knew, had the baby, and made it home to graduate. When it was all over, I promised my mother that I would never tell anybody this story, and I kept that promise to her for 38 years, until very recently when I wrote a book, my memoir called Look at You Now. So, it only takes about a 2-minute version of this story to see that it is fraught with lies, secrets, deception, betrayal, gossip, rumors, judgment, shame, all of the things that we try so hard to stay away from in life because they make it so difficult and so painful. I wanted to mostly talk about sort of what I went through internally to get to the other side of this experience. So I arrive in this place, and I meet the girls, and I learn that they're on pregnant leave from juvenile detention or failed foster care or from the streets. And of course, my instinct is to just run as far and as fast as I can get, but I had nowhere to go. And I lived pretty terrified in this place for weeks until I started to question things. At a certain point, it felt like everything I thought I knew about the world, all of the things I had been taught to believe about people and about life, felt like they sort of dropped off of me and vanished. And I started to see that these girls and I had everything in common that actually mattered. We were teenagers and we were pregnant. I started to get to know them. They were very different than I thought. They were interesting, funny. In fact, they were hilarious. They told me stories about their lives and their adventures with the law. And I shared my life about my family and skiing and sailing. They taught me how to play poker. I read books to them. They made rich girl jokes. I never quite had the balls to make poor girl jokes, but we were like soldiers in a platoon. I mean, bonded over this pregnancy. These girls who I thought were hardened teenage gangsters were really mostly these endearing misfit toys, and I sort of became one of them. When people hear this story, I often hear the word strength. Everybody talks about the strength and grit, it takes to get through challenge. I really think it was the removal of judgment that helped me get to the other side of this story, because looking back on it, that is what dropped off and vanished. The judgment I had of these girls and their lives and their poverty. And once it was gone, I was sort of able to see them for who they really were. And then, of course, it trickled down to me and the judgment I had of myself, which was massive. I was racked with guilt and shame and hating myself for the mess I'd made of my life and the disgrace I had become to my parents. All of that stuff inside of me started to let up a little bit. I stopped beating myself up and actually imagined that maybe I could have a good life even had I been in this place. The things inside of me started to feel just a little bit kinder and a little more forgiving. There is something about the removal of judgment that brings this indescribable meaning to the word open. Your mind opens, your heart opens, everything opens when judgment is gone. Things around you feel so different. They feel safer and better. It makes me think, you know how you have a couple people in your life, if you're lucky, when you're around them and you walk away and you can't help thinking, God, I really like that person. That feeling, and you don't quite know what it is, but the truth is you feel good around them. In fact, you feel really good about being who you are when you're around them. That person is open, and they don't have judgment. That's sort of what it feels like and what it looks like. So if I were, I know I can't, but if I were to ask everybody in here, how often do you think you judge yourself? You think about that for a minute. I'm going to guess that whatever your answer is, it's a whole lot more. Because judgment is really tricky, because it's a habit and it can go so unnoticed, particularly self-judgment, because there's sort of perceived virtue to it, that it's okay because you're not hurting anybody else, right? So here's the test. The next time a challenge comes in, just notice. Pay attention to what goes on inside of you. Is it, do you feel something sort of rooting for you that's on your side, reminding you you've been through stuff before and you're going to get through this? Or do you have an asshole in there? Because an asshole is what reminds us of all the things that we cannot stand about ourselves, particularly when we're in challenge. It is from where all the doubt comes. And then, of course, the doubt comes in, and then comes the fear, and the fear comes in to scare the crap out of you. That is self-judgment. We don't need an enemy in there, making the hard times harder. We kind of really need an ally. The only voice that matters, the only voice that truly makes a difference in your life is your own. 3 days after I had the baby at 17, I had to go home and actually walk in the ceremony of my high school graduation. It was some rule. And today I can't seem to figure out what was scarier, giving birth to a baby out of my body in that facility, or going home and facing my peers after 5 months of being gone, knowing somewhere in my heart that this lie was not going to hold up and the judgment and scrutiny I might have to face. So I arrived at graduation, and I was right. The lie kind of didn't hold up all the way. Lots of kids had made their own ideas of where I had been, and there was whispering and pointing and gesturing, and it was quite a lot worse than I thought it was going to be. But what surprised me the most was that I sort of just waited there to feel like I wanted to burst out crying or run away or flip everybody off or hate myself. And none of that happened. And I realized that day that all I had gone through internally to survive in this facility was exactly what I was going to need to survive my life. And I knew I had it. So, if there were one thing that I could encourage anyone to do in this life, it would be to think about letting go of judgment, particularly the judgment you have on yourself. Because to be able to create and have inside of you a place that you can turn that will hold you up and root for you would be quite a gift. Thank you.